There's an inflection point in the mentality of entrepreneurs. You're not thinking just locally in your region. You're thinking, how do I build the best business globally? The founders that have this unstoppable, inevitable drive and mission to be successful are the ones that don't stop when it gets difficult. There is a guarantee they're going to face incredible obstacles along the way. And those that are able to adapt and overcome those obstacles are the ones that are doing it for the reason that has meaning beyond just making money. Fundraising is a teachable skill. Of course, there's certain founders that are naturally more inclined to be able to articulate a vision and get someone excited and understand how to kind of make an investor move. But we've gotten pretty good at understanding what the anatomy of a good fundraising process looks like. And if you can't learn that, then you're not really someone we would back. A lot of the funds in LATAM are very we do LATAM moat specific things. And we have just followed the talent. Going back to the numbers, 3% of the founders were building global companies 5 years ago. Now it's close to 50%. It's at 46% from our last cohort.
When you look at these companies like Enter AI or Pax, raising those crazy rounds, like tens of millions to hundreds of millions from firms like Founders Fund, Benchmark, Index, Sequoia, Green Oaks, what exactly are they underwriting right now in
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the J-Curve. Today's guest is Brian Requarth, founder of Viva Real, general partner at Latitude, and one of the people with the best vantage point on what's happening across Latin American startups today. In this episode, we discuss why Silicon Valley is investing in Latin America again, what exceptional founders have in common, how AI is changing the rules of company building, how Latitude built one of the strongest founder ecosystems in the region, and the biggest mistakes founders make when raising venture capital. Before we jump into the conversation, one quick update for the founder community. We're launching the J-Curve referral program. If you're a tech founder who is raising or planning to raise venture capital, this one is for you. Refer 3 founders to the J-Curve and you'll unlock my masterclass, How to Build a Brand That Raises Money, where I break down the exact frameworks behind storytelling, distribution, investor relationships, and building credibility long before you open a funding round. Refer 5 founders, and you'll unlock a private one-on-one fundraising session with me, where we'll go deep on your deck, fundraising narrative, positioning, and how to make your story more compelling. You can find all the details and subscribe to our newsletters at www.thejcurve.com. And if you're enjoying the podcast, I'd appreciate if you left us a rating and review on Spotify or YouTube at the J-Curve Podcast. It really helps more founders discover those conversations. You can also follow me on Instagram at Olga Maslikhova with KH for behind-the-scene content, founder insights, and everything we're building at the J-Curve. Now let's get into the show.
Should we do this?
We should do this.
Yeah, this is an honor for me.
It's an honor for me because I remember when I met you first, it was around 5 years ago. At your beautiful, gorgeous house from which you're relocating very soon. Obviously, I've been, watching your journey, and I have interviewed a bunch of people from the Latitude ecosystem. I have tremendous respect for what you built, so I'm super excited to do that finally.
Congrats on what you've done with the podcast too. I know how hard it is to get out there, and all the prep work you do is amazing. And so, having done a bunch of episodes myself, I have a lot of appreciation for what you've done.
Your feedback means so much for me because you understand the hustle.
Yeah.
There's so many interesting things about you. And one of them is that you're sitting at this very unique position between Silicon Valley, breakthrough tech capital, and Latin American founders and talent. And when you look at these companies like Enter AI, the legal AI startup, right? Or Pax, the AI native public safety company, raising those crazy rounds, like tens of millions to hundreds of millions from firms like Founders Fund, Benchmark, Index, Sequoia, Green Oaks. What exactly are they underwriting right now in Latin America?
Well, first of all, as a founder who, when I started, I went and I pitched 5 investors. You can count them on one hand, and then that was it, right? There was no other option. It just ended, right? You're like, okay, well, now what do I do now? I guess I'll go generate some revenue so that I can
fund my growth.
Exactly. In terms of those companies, look, both are in my anti-portfolio because I met Mateos, actually, the house you went to. I had him and a bunch of Stanford students over there. So, and I'm very open about those things that I miss. I saw it early. I was a little cheap, I think, and I just didn't, I was mixing with many other things going on at the time. I didn't miss the last one. It's an exciting deal that just got announced recently, Taste. I don't know if you saw
Yeah,
Taste.
yeah, I saw
So first
things.
investor in that one. So you live and learn when it's like, it looks kind of expensive and then you're like, all right, maybe I should, maybe I should step up a little bit. So you live and learn with these things. But yeah, I mean, look, PAX, Enter, these are massive industries. Like these are the cornerstone industries of markets, right? They're some of the most value creation possible. We're at this inflection point where AI is completely transforming how these businesses operate. And so when you've got an AI native perspective on this, whether they're going to be, 10, 20, 30, $40 billion companies is yet to be seen. But there's a real shot at these players if you can win an industry. We've seen what's happened in banking. Melly is obviously another example. So there are outcomes that can be generated that are large enough to justify the valuation that was put on those companies.
So you think they preliminary underwrite the market opportunity and the fact that you can build billion-dollar industries, or, the founder's profile?
It's got to be a mix of everything, right? At the early days, you can get away with underwriting the founder and not the market because good founders find the market. But when you're talking about the terms we're talking about, obviously there's the combination. And I think both of, David and Mateos, those guys are amazing, They're so magnetic. They've got vision. They've got, Mateos, like his whole background at Harvard as the youngest, graduate of, law there at 19 or whatever. These are outlier people, right? And so I think that that's probably what got them in the door and got the accelerated interest in the beginning. And then the execution has to be there too, right? So there's some numbers behind this. So it's combined with those three things, which is the talent, the execution, right? Speed of execution, the velocity. It's not just speed because you can move really fast. If you're going in the wrong direction, you end up in the wrong destination. So those guys, I think they're executing really well. And then, the market is enormous, right? So I think they've got all the ingredients to build big companies.
So you compare the founder who raised a venture capital in Latin America a decade ago with the founder attracting global capital today. What are the biggest differences you see in terms of how they think, how they build, and how they operate?
The clear, immediate thing that I observe is the size of the ambition. Like, first off, like I remember it was 60 of us. We went to China. And we met all these entrepreneurs in China. This was with Monashees. Shout out to Monashees. And I remember one of the things that I reflected on, I was like, man, in Brazil, we're just thinking way too small. Like that was just it was so evident to me being in the room with these entrepreneurs from China, the size of their ambition and, the limitation you put on yourself. We are at a moment in time today. There's an inflection point in the mentality of entrepreneurs that is a complete different shift in what's possible. You're not thinking just, locally in your region or even in the country. You're thinking, how do I build the best business globally? And I think that in order for that to happen, you have to build on the shoulders of giants, right? There's the example, before us where someone does something and then it becomes a breakthrough thing. If you think about the mile, running a mile, right? This was a huge thing, the 4-minute mark, like who can break that, And it took years for that to happen. And then all of a sudden, someone broke 4-minute, and then it was just like again. And it's not that like, the physical specimen. Of course, there's some progress in terms of like, nutrition and other things that are variables that contribute to that. But I think a lot of it is the mindset of what's possible to be able to break through and hit those milestones. So I think that's the biggest shift. Obviously, capital markets are larger too. There's more money available. But I'd say if I were to say the number one thing, it's the mindset shift that exists.
You mentioned to me before that right now, almost half of LATAM-born founders say that they're building for global markets from day one, up from something like 4% just 5 years ago. That number, I remember it jumped at me when we had our prep call. But why is that? Like, what's driving that besides the number of examples of successful founders who came before?
Yeah, I mean, clearly, like, there's this thing called AI that,
I've never heard about that. Come on.
basically every conversation you have with any tech people, it ends up in
It begins and it ends up pretty
begins
much
and
the
ends
same.
in the middle, and so yeah, look, the AI super cycle is just collapsing the borders, right? It's making it easier than ever to build, the speed of being able to execute. So I think when you combine that with the ambition and the self-belief that I belong at the seat of the table, there's the whole like Vita Lata, like I don't know
You
if you know.
have to explain what that is
Vita
to the
Lata is
user.
basically like the stray dog. I don't
Like the
really.
underdog mentality
It's the
type of
underdog
stuff.
mentality, but it's not only not the underdog mentality of like, oh, I can do it, I'm the underdog. It's the underdog mentality of like, oh, I don't know if I totally belong here. A little bit of the what's the syndrome where you don't believe in yourself.
Sure, imposter syndrome.
Imposter syndrome. I removed that shit out of my head because I had it alone. I couldn't even remember in this interview. So it's that is a little bit of the Vita Lata.
Yeah.
It's the syndrome de Vita Lata. I've seen this, and what happens is, I've been hosting more and more founders in the Bay Area from Brazil, from Colombia, from Argentina, and they're spending time and they're seeing these operators, these founders, these builders that are having some success, and they're like, you know what, like, I'm not different, and I think that right to win is starting to happen, and so that's something that the AI super cycle combined with this mindset shift, these two. The convergence, the confluence of these two things, I think that's really kicking off this moment in time that we're experiencing.
So when you look at all of those founders whom you host or whom you invest in or
Yeah.
who you're, part of the same community, like a decade ago, they were building, the next Mercado Libre, right?
Yeah.
Or the next iFood or the next new bank. What are they dreaming about building today?
Everything. I mean, from like, you saw that announcement of Taste the other day, like building the taste infrastructure for the labs so they can, understand subjective domains like design better, which they're terrible at today. Like, this is a crazy ambitious business that went totally viral a few weeks ago. And that, is an example of something that, as a Brazilian founder, she's building a global company. She's selling into the top labs. Like, this is the highest caliber. But I'm seeing everything from, I don't know if I can get into details, but like a biotech founder, from the south of Brazil, who comes from this world of biotech that is doing virtual organs for drug testing, computational models to allow you to accelerate the speed of drug testing. That's the variety of things that we're seeing. And so I think that again, going back to the limitations that you put on yourself, you remove those limitations, you're in this environment, and then you start saying, you know what, I belong at the table here.
Building global from day one, it's a fairly new, right? Like, and a lot of people used to be very skeptical about global companies from Brazil. And I remember when I just got into Brazil and I was talking about the global businesses from here because everything is in place. And people were like, but why? Like, why would you do that? And Brazil is so big and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of rational counter arguments. But now we do start seeing more examples of that, both successful companies that are already like built out in Brazil and then they expanded to the US, or those who are global by default. But I'm really curious, what is like global from day one actually mean? Like, do the founders optimize for like different set of constraints? Do they hire differently? Do they think differently? Like, what does that mean?
I think there's a couple different buckets, right? Yeah. There's the big confidence of the world that are like start in Brazil. They go after that market in Brazil, big ambitions beyond the borders. Then they Spanish-speaking LATAM. Robson moves to San Francisco, goes deep in the AI stuff. Now they have customers in 40 plus countries, right? So that's an example of like the local, expansion regionally, and then there's an incremental. And I think that the thing about that is it's a B2C business, but the speed has just dramatically reduced what's possible in terms of starting here and then spreading out, right? In 2.5 years, they've built a really big business, large revenue. It's something that is a global business that started local, right? So that's one kind of bucket, and I think we're seeing a lot of that happening. And the way you build that business is obviously different than the business that you pick up. You're sleeping on your friend's couch in San Francisco. You're building your initial team. Maybe it's straddled between San Francisco and Brazil, or wherever, it's a different DNA of a company that's like your first customers are in the US. So we're seeing both of those things. And then of course, like when I look at Latitude, I look at, where we're deploying capital. It's not that I'm not investing in Brazil or Mexico or other markets in Latin America. We are, but I've always been a talent investor. I'm not the person that's going to just predict the future of markets. Like you've got Paulo Passoni on these. He's smarter than I am in understanding about
He's smarter than all of us.
what's happening and what the future looks like. I'll let him play that game. What am I really good at? And what are we really good at Latitude? We're good at understanding what it takes. What are the qualities of a founder that are going to make that person successful in building a company? And so our job is to basically find those people in the corners of the longitudes and latitudes of the region, bring them, help them, give them a little boost, give them some early support, connect them with networks, capital, customers, and, get them on their way. So that's kind of what we've focused on. And it just so happens that the best people, instead of just building things only in Brazil, there's a mindset shift of like, okay, I'm going to do Brazil. I'm going to do multiple markets. I'm going to go to the US. I'm going to, kind of leave the home cooking at my house in Sao Paulo. And I'm going to live in San Francisco and, have a different lifestyle. It's going to be intense. But I think that the energy, the belief that that's possible, I've never seen it brighter in LATAM in terms of the talent.
How important it is for founders to be in Bay Area, either to just what you said, relocate to Bay Area or be exposed to Bay Area if they're building initially for a different set of markets.
Yeah, I think if your customers are in Brazil, then you should be in Brazil. However, you had Felipe from Camus, great guy, go-to-market expert, one of the best. With Yuri, who also, is a dear friend and an amazing entrepreneur now leading Camus. If you look at what's happened in that company, the company is doing really well. It's still very early days, but I've seen firsthand, the team comes up, I host them in, the Bay Area, they stay at my house, and then we get in the mix. We're, spending time with the labs, we're spending time with the investors. It is the mindset shift that happens and the speed that, accelerates your thinking. The sense of urgency that we got when we went as a team for the first time, even though I live in the Bay Area, I live up just north of the
Sonoma.
Yeah, I live in wine country. I don't think I had the same urgency until I spent, multiple days, weeks, months in the Bay Area, in SF particularly, because the speed of things happening is it's unparalleled. And so whether you need to actually be there full time, it depends on your business. If you're working closely with the labs, you should be in San Francisco. Like there's just no other place to be. But if you're building a company where you're, deep in workflows in Brazil, like in taxes or something else, being in SF the whole time would not benefit you. You need to be close to your customers, the market. But if you're neglecting what's happening in the Bay Area right now, you're missing a huge understanding about, where they say in hockey, you got to skate to where the puck is going. Like the puck is heading over there. You're over here. You need to be, near the puck if you're going to score a goal.
You mentioned that you're really good at understanding who the best founders are, and you do that across different countries. So I'd love for you to go a little bit deeper into all of the different things that make the team, the best team, and founders as individuals, the best founders.
Sure.
Because best founder is just such a broad definition of people. And I don't know, how many companies do you look at Latitude annually on average?
A few thousand, yeah. Our fellowship, we usually over about 1,500, 1,600 applications, and we select about 15 a year.
So out of 1,500, you select
1%, yeah.
1%.
Yeah.
So
I'm not going to tell you my secret sauce, okay, Olga? I'm just kidding. I'm just joking. I mean, look, it's a bit of science and a bit of art. We don't have the perfect, understanding. Sometimes it's feeling. Sometimes it's, what they've been able to demonstrate. So at a high level, we're underwriting the founder, right? Again, like we're not underwriting the market when we invest. The market can change.
You don't underwrite the revenue, right? Because in many cases, there's no revenue.
I mean,
there's no product.
We're literally, we talk a lot about -1 to 0. Everyone talks about 0 to 1, Peter Thiel. We talk at Latitude -1 to 0. Yeah. So
What does that mean?
it means that there isn't anything. I mean, they may still be working in another company when we first meet them, right?
Yeah.
They may, just have an idea. They may not know what they're going to build, but underwriting the caliber of the person, obviously it's a combination of, the ambition, what they've demonstrated in the past, a unique insight that they have. So there's a kind of an elixir of all of these things that we look at, and we have our, in the top of the funnel, we get applications. We do have this kind of algorithmic look at things, and it's not perfect, but it's pretty good at reducing things down into kind of a balsamic reduction sauce of quality. So we have these signals that we kind of look at. There's some things that are very, very obvious, like where they worked before, what have they built, their network, right? Like who are they already connected to? And obviously those are limiting factors. And sometimes you'll find a diamond in the rough that doesn't get flagged by the algorithm. But generally it does a pretty good job of reducing down into like, now kind of 5 to 10% of the, 1,000 plus, 1,500. So we're now down to like 50 to 100 people. And then there's a qualitative aspect of, you have to have a deep conversation with the person. It gets very difficult at the last like 15. We're not going to get it right. There's going to be some founders that we pass on that don't make the cut. And, we got to stay close. Fortunately, we have the check that we write at the fellowship. And then we also have another check that we can do in case we miss them in the fellowship, and we can write the pre-seed. So we lead pre-seed, first institutional check. But yeah, there's a systematic way that after 5.5 years, almost 6 years now of, I don't even know how many applicants. I should have the data, on the top of my head, but there's like, thousands of people that have applied and gone through Latitude. And there's been an evolution of how we've done that. So just to give you a little kind of context, when we started Latitude, one thing that I knew was that I wanted to work with founders at the earliest days. I wanted to build some kind of like accelerator type platform. But the truth is, there's an insight that I had that I'm really glad that, we got clarity on this. If you launch an accelerator without having a brand or a demonstrated track record, you're basically going to get adverse selection, right? You're going to get the founders that are like,
They cannot raise anywhere else.
exactly. They just come to you and be like, hey, I need help, And so what we did was we intentionally did not take any equity. It was an equity-free program. And we've had over 1,000 founders that have gone through our fellowship. Collectively, they've raised over $1 billion in venture. And someone might look at that and be like, it's kind of dumb that you did all this work and you didn't have any economic participation in many of these companies. We did slide a few checks in. Pomelo was in the, the second cohort. We managed to talk to Gaston and be like, hey, Gaston, we like what you're doing. Can we be your first check? It wasn't even a PowerPoint yet. It was very early. That one turned out pretty good. So we got really good at identifying and seeing patterns. And we ensured that we had the best founders as part of our network in our orbit. Because if we had, fixed terms for Gaston, he would have been like, no, I'm good. I got access to a lot of people. I can go raise. And so we did it for 5 years. So we built 5 years of goodwill.
The difference between how many companies are on top of the funnel versus how many companies get the check is insane. 1%. Harder than getting into either of the Ivy Leagues in the United States. So I'm curious, like in terms of why do you say no or yes? And how do you move those companies down the funnel?
On the moving down the funnel, we heavily depend on AI to do that, right? Because we actually developed this kind of proprietary algorithm that we were inspired by 2 different data kind of plays. One, if anyone plays chess, there's something called ELO, which is your individual chess score. And it's really a simulation of like, if my rating is a 1,600 and yours is an 1,800, probability of you winning is pretty high, because of past games. And so we've been able to kind of corral a bunch of information. There's also like a tennis rating. So if you're a tennis player, maybe you're a 4.5, that's a rating, and you're playing a 4.2. If you beat the 4.5, your rating goes up. And so we kind of create this like simulated environment based on all these variables that we think are salient to being successful as a founder. And that enables us to at least reduce it down to, this kind of short list of sub 100, usually 50 to 100. And then at that point, there's a qualitative aspect. I mean, the energy of the founder, are they like There's the founder that you just talk to them and it's contagious.
Yeah.
And you're like, I just want to spend more time with this founder. Like they feel inevitable, unstoppable. And that's something it's hard to pick up through an algorithm or like, reading the data because people are using AI to write their shit anyway, right?
Human.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I think that is a key kind of fundamental part. But, we're a tiny team at Latitude. So
How many people?
there's 5 people right now on the team. And we're covering from,
Thousands of
Bay Area
applications.
to, the tip of, Tierra del Fuego, right? So it's a lot of it's a fairly large latitude to cover.
So when you get down to those 30, for example,
Yeah.
to select 15 out of
Sure.
those 30, what are the most common reasons or patterns that you say no to the founders?
The motivation of the person, like why they're building it is a super important variable. I mentioned this woman that's building virtual, organs for drug testing. And, her motivation is, long-term, she wants to solve cancer. Her grandparents died of cancer. And that, that is an unflappable determination. And not everyone has to have a story like that. But the founders that have this just unstoppable, inevitable drive and mission to be successful are the ones that don't stop when it gets difficult. There is a guarantee they're going to face incredible obstacles along the way. And those that are able to adapt and overcome those obstacles are the ones that are doing it for the reason that has meaning beyond just making money or, not to say that it can't work if you don't have some kind of underlying motivation, but that's something that we notice. If you combine that with the intellectual horsepower and ability and demonstrated execution up until now and insane network to, unlock, all of these things culminate into someone that's, kind of unstoppable.
How do you test for ambitions?
Yeah.
How do you know if those are real?
Look, I came from San Francisco or Bay Area. I grew up in the Bay Area, right? I ended up in Brazil, sleeping on my co-founder's couch, married. My poor wife was, sleeping in the living room with me. We're, trying to have a baby at the same time I'm trying to get this thing going. I could have gone back to California, worked a job locally. My family had a small business that I could have, I spent 6 months working at before I made my way down to South America. Could have been very comfortable. Like, you've been to wine country. Like, this is like a nice place,
It's a
right?
paradise. No,
So if I'm like selling the only asset that I have, which was an apartment, 99% of my net worth, I'm selling that. I'm convincing my wife it's a good idea to do this. She's down for the cause. She moves with me. We go to this foreign country. Neither one of us speak the language, and we're trying to start a family, and it's something completely foreign. I don't know. Let me ask you, do you think that's high conviction?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's your answer. So I think that I know what it looks like because I've seen it in myself and I've seen it in the best founders. And I hate to be very generic, but you know it when you see it.
I think that what makes, like, when you think about best founders, when you think about best investors, it goes down to pattern recognition, right? That if you boil it down, it's going to be your personal experience of interaction with people, and just like observing tremendous number of data points, being it like other humans, problems, and so on and so forth. So that's why I think like personal experience in this type of business that you are in, especially in the earliest, like it will not be substituted.
I will say that there's all types of profiles, because if I only went after the strictly like more charismatic, kind of motivated, like, profile of founders, I mean, I'm seeing more and more younger technical founders also with like just insane IQ also combined with EQ. And, that's a different profile. Like that wasn't me. Like I wasn't the smartest founder starting out. I wasn't like, a dropout, physics dropout from name the university, right? So there's also other patterns and there's other personas that we look at And we do have kind of like, at this point, a little bit of like, what's the persona? We don't have names for these personas, but we see them and we identify, oh, this is, so they're not all about the first persona that I described. There's multiple personas that can be successful. And I remember when Julio did that like report of like, I was in, yeah, and Lunchico did that report about like the different personas. And I thought that was like a pretty revealing description. And it's something that we had been thinking about and talking about as a firm, what kind of bucket, what does this founder look like?
Interesting that you said now persona, because like when you think about the portfolios of great Silicon Valley firms, for example, founders funds, there are many similarities in terms of what kind of people they back. Like they're very specific in terms of who their like founders fund personality is. Do you have anything similar in mind for what kind of people?
We're a very different firm than Founders Fund. Founders Fund does very few investments. They go extremely heavy into their investments. So like I would describe them as more of a thesis-driven fund.
Right.
And we're not that, and we also think that like success can come in many different packages.
How important is a fundraising skill or selling skill to the founders, and how important that is in your mental framework of evaluating founders?
I think that there's founders that excel at that naturally, that are very, very gifted in communication and understanding the psychology of how that works. I will say that it is not like an absolute requirement for us because it's a teachable skill. Fundraising is a teachable skill. Of course, there's certain founders that are naturally more inclined to be able to like articulate a vision and get someone excited and understand how to kind of make an investor move. But we've gotten pretty good at understanding what the anatomy of a good fundraising process looks like. And if you can't learn that, then you're not really someone we would back, right? So the person obviously has to have an ability to be able to learn. I think that speaking on the ability to learn, what I would describe as the velocity of learning is one of the biggest variables that I look at. So if we have a conversation with someone and then we talk to them 2 weeks later, there's a stark contrast from founders that are kind of stuck and other ones, it's like they're almost like they're at a new stage 3 weeks later. So people that have demonstrated that ability, whether that's in products or that's in just like clarity on how the ICP evolves and, design partners and whatever it is at the early days that kind of needs evolution quickly. If I'm playing chess and you're a grandmaster and I'm playing and I get to move 2 times to your 1 move, like, regardless if you're a grandmaster, I've got a pretty good chance at beating you, even if I'm a mediocre player. And so that is a competitive advantage. And so that's a pattern that we see, amongst the best founders. Now, when I say speed, I don't want to just focus only on speed. I want to focus on velocity, going back to what I said before, because you've got to be heading the right direction too. It's the combination of speed and direction.
What is the anatomy of a good fundraising process? You made me very curious about that.
So first of all, there's one thing that I really like. It's a quote from Abraham Lincoln, which is, if you've got 6 hours to chop down a tree, spend the first 5 sharpening the axe. Okay. And then boom. And the reality is founders sometimes just go to market and they're like, they haven't thought about a systematic process. So before you go to market, and I'm talking about pre-seed, seed kind of range, right? Because that's when we come in. I think it applies to multi-stage, but there's a particular way of fundraising at the early days that's probably a little bit different than you're raising a Series B, right? The percentage of value that an investor is going to put on the quality of the person, their personal story, how they're the first hires that they're making, the team that they're building, how they articulate the market, their unique insight. Those are absolutely, there's 100% of the judgment that an investor is looking at when they decide to invest. That slowly becomes, traction and growth, like as you move down the stack of, seed, Series A, Series B, Series C, et cetera. So it's about the impression and the energy you're able to generate. And so prepping and understanding, one, who the investor is, what they've invested in, and then I'd say one of the most important things, it's basically reverse engineering some of the signal that exists. So what does that look like? There's a concept that I really like. It's called retrospective rationalization. And that's when you kind of look back and you're like, you did something really good and you're like, yeah, I did that. Like I kind of saw what that was. But the truth is I did this, and I'm using retrospective rationalization because I didn't actually plan it. But what I was able to do as a founder is I was able to, well, first of all, I struck out for 4 years trying to raise money. I went to those 5 investors and none of them said yes. And so I had to go back to building. And when I did finally get some success in fundraising, I was able to pinpoint the highest caliber and highest signal early believers. So I was able to get a guy by the name of Simon Baker who, built the largest, at this time, property portal in Australia, multi-billion-dollar company. I was able to get Mickey Malka, for Ribbit, it was before Ribbit, but legendary entrepreneur and hyper net worth. I got a guy by the name of Greg Waldorf, who was EIR at Excel, Wences Casades. I got these names. And what I was actually doing was kind of collecting signal. And it was signal that was like opening to downstream capital. It was signal like in terms of operating experience, like people that had built similar businesses. And so all of these things basically, I remember going to like Kazek and Monashi's and, raising our Series A at this point, which was now more like a seed round because things have changed since then. There was some doubts on certain things. And I'm like, look at your LPs are already investors in me, Remember like communicating that. And it's like kind of easy to overcome the objection of like, look at your people that invested in your fund, they're already directly coming to me. Maybe you should also be investing in me. And so I think that combine that with, so kind of reverse engineering what like makes sense in the eyes of an investor and understanding the psychology of how investors evaluate things. If you combine that with the calendar density, because at the early days, there's a window, if you're going out to fundraise, you did that kind of, sharpening the axe, you're listing all of the potential candidates that would be good fit for what you're doing, whether that's in Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, the US, and you're lining up in a short period where you've kind of stacked them all together and you're able to go back to back in those meetings. That is one of the key elements to having a successful fundraise because you're kind of creating inertia for yourself, right? And they're not all going to say yes, they're not going to say no, but you're at least stacking up your chances because it creates some competitive dynamics. And you combine that with having high signal people, like this is basically how you execute a good fundraising in the early days. And there's many other variables on how to make this successful. We could probably do a whole episode on that, frankly. There's a lot of thoughts I have on how to set yourself up for success when you're fundraising.
Go into maybe 1 to 2 more elements. I really like those insights. I want to build on them.
Let's see.
So and it could be like a great thumbnail for the episode. How to set yourself for success in fundraising.
There's a guy named Jason Ye who we brought on. He's like, advises some of our founders. He's a great guy. Shout out to Jason. I missed him in Mexico City at the World Cup, but he has led some amazing sessions for our fellows, and we brought him back in recently. And, there's a great image that he has where it's like, 2 scenarios. It's like you chasing the investors. You really want to figure out how to be chased, so like kind of that visual of like orchestrating in a way where like you're kind of being chased.
How much of that is brand building, for example?
I think a lot of it can be brand, and that's like, so first of all, you have to lean into your strengths, right?
Right.
If that is your skill and you can captivate an audience in a setting like a podcast or whatever it is, like you should lean into your LinkedIn or lean into whatever your X and like be out there and be a thought leader. I think that's absolutely critical. Now, another thing is like, maybe you just pulled like the most badass CTO from the hottest AI company that decided to forego, multiple $1 million of equity to go start something. It's like a major flex, right? If you're talking to an investor and you're like, look at so-and-so just left, and now they're coming on board, like that is going to have investors kind of, drooling in some ways. There's maybe some fundamental aspects of like the anatomy of a good fundraising that exist. And then there's like some deeper, more personalized things. Like when I talk to a founder, I'm kind of a therapist in this way. Like I'm like listening to them. I'm also constructing a narrative on my mind about the founder, right? Like, it's the super young, amazing, articulate founder that's like just got out of school, but they've already like built a company at 17 and they dropped out of school and, were like, they've they're a math Olympiad over here. Like, so there's these little things that I just understand that the perception of this from a seed or a Series A investor, it's going to like get their attention. And so we're tastemakers. Like we're able to kind of understand what it is, what, if you think about like, I grew up in the wine world, right? Robert Parker is like this, wine guru that he like puts his little stamp of approval,
And that's it. You're legit.
yeah, and then you're
Yeah.
you're made, right? I'm not saying we're on that caliber and that, but we try to, aspire to be in that arena where we're able to identify and pick the best people. I think that's the evolution of Latitude, because historically we had this like large network and, we were just kind of building community, which was an amazing way to create, some of this momentum, and momentum begets more momentum. And now we're at this phase where it's like, okay, we have this like, huge network of people. We got thousands of people that apply. Now we're more tastemakers in understanding who are the highest caliber folks. We pick them. They pick us too, hopefully. We run them through a multi-month program, and then we bring them to the Bay Area, and, they're connecting with Andreessen, Anthropic, OpenAI, NFX, top funds, angels, founders that have built amazing companies. And we're getting them in this, this kind of ecosystem that accelerates their journey also, and accelerates their thinking, but accelerates their network at the same time.
Community is very interesting because it feels like building the community has always been a major part of your life. And I've heard from someone that you used to host this founder type of breakfasts in Sao Paulo, like during your
that wasn't even
Viva Real.
that wasn't even my there was five of us, and we would get together and have, a little breakfast with some very high caliber founders during my cohort of, building. And, it was great because I think that was more out of necessity for me to like have some kind of, I was like, alone, didn't know a lot of people. And you know what it's like if someone has a shared experience, like founders, there's a kinship. There's like a lot to talk about. There's a connection. There's a shared empathy, understanding. And so I was searching for that. Like I was needing that. I was feeling lonely. I was feeling like I was struggling. I had, every founder goes through lots of ups and downs. I like to say your best day and your worst day are the same day. And having somebody to be able to share that with, learn from, I think that's something that, was in kind of the DNA of building my company. We built a community of real estate companies. So there's always been a bit of a community element, and I kind of understood the power of that. And I've kind of transferred it to multiple phases of, whether that's from Viva Real to Latitude. Camus doing some stuff in the
you have
world.
podcasts, right? That is also a events.
Yeah, and I'm going to be doing way more stuff in San Francisco now that I'm kind of, steady there. One of our partners, Louisa, she's coming out to San Francisco, and I'm going to be hosting dinners and gatherings. So I think it's been the DNA of what we've built.
It's very interesting because there's so many people who talk about building communities, and we're community forward and so on and so forth. But a lot of them end up being just the networks, like
Yeah.
what do you think are the critical distinctions between strong community versus a network of people?
It's a great question. The first thing I thought of was you need to cultivate a give first mentality. So if there is like just a willingness to help out and build value for the other person, that is the absolute kind of like DNA of a good community. And it's something that I like discovered, I sold my company. We signed the deal March 4th, 2020 at Viva Real, Grupo Zap. And, I'm here figuring out what I'm going to do next. And I had this realization where I'm like, I want to, figure out how to elevate other founders. And I made it a mission to like, I'm going to help as many founders as I can without expecting anything. And it started by taking about 150 Zoom calls from founders, founders that had a term sheet pulled during COVID, or that had to fire 90% of their team, or things were actually taking off during COVID and they're figuring out what, how they need to. So I think that was just really how it started for me. And that kind of compounded. And what I realized is that amazing thing happened. Like, look, I respond to messages on LinkedIn, random people. And I've ended up doing investments in founders. And, I go back to Viva Real. My first serious investor, I was able to get in touch with him from a Facebook message that I sent him. And this guy saved the company, wired $300K when we had $87 in the bank account and 25 employees, and just completely changed the trajectory of my business. And so, I just think that there's, of course, like it's harder now because I get a lot more messages than I used to. And I can't respond to every single one of them, especially when it's like AI slop in my inbox. Then I'm just like instant,
Delete.
yeah, ciao. But I can tell the difference between a well-crafted message that shows like, you didn't just ask Claude what you should send me. And it was like, oh, I read his, his book, or I've listened to these podcast episodes, or whatever it is. That to me, like, gets my attention enough to, take a call or like at least connect with the team and, see if there's anything there. So I think that kind of value creation first mentality was how we set this community up, and this willingness to build value for other people without expecting something. It compounds, like kindness compounds over time.
How do you scale that? Because right now your community, like one part of it is offline things that you're doing, like dinners and so on and so forth. But your community is so much more than what you could possibly accumulate offline.
You just work your fucking ass up.
Let's talk a little bit about Latitude. Latitude is very interesting. It feels like, to me personal, it feels like a collection of businesses and initiatives that reinforce each other. So you have the fellowship, right? You have the community, you have podcasts, you have angel network, events, venture funds. So when you think about like deconstructing the core pillars of Latitude, what are those and how do those pieces work together to create this flywheel?
The reality is like, we're just entrepreneurs. Like I'm just a founder. Right? I'm just testing shit. And I'm like, oh, does this work? And then, I think there's some ingredients that have worked well, other things that like, we've changed a lot over the years. We've tested stuff and I've messed some things up, right? Like I started a company inside Latitude. We raised capital in the holdco and you just live and learn, right? Like, lots of mistakes have been made. You kind of correct your mistake, you learn something from it, and then you move on. I think at the essence, what we're building is really, it's the platform, it's the on-ramp to building the best global companies from Latin American founders. And I think that everything I described in terms of trying to build value, we've been able to dissect fairly well, like what it takes to be successful in the early days. And actually, I went back and, Yuri and Felipe worked together in Camus for a little while. And I went back into the kind of the driver's seat of running a company again for a little while. So I carved off from the fund for a little bit. I was still investing, but it was something I did mainly because I felt like I was a little stale.
Yeah.
Like, things have changed from, Viva Real. And I don't want to be that guy kind of just sitting back and being like, oh, in my day, this is how it was. So I went to throw myself back into the mix. I was there for about 18 months, 12 to 18 months. Doing discovery calls with customers. I took 150 calls with the team in Portuguese talking to tax people. I mean, you got to be a real, little crazy person to do this because it's like, I'm going back into this from day one. I don't really need to do this, but I feel like I want to be in tune with what the founders are experiencing. So I had to subject myself to the pain again in order to actually speak with some credibility. So I did that. I realized that one, Yuri is a much better CEO at this stage of the company because we're in the AI era. The guy's been, building machine learning since before it was AI. And, that's kind of, became very clear that he would be the best candidate. Combined with the fact that I'm in the Bay Area and it's hard for me to run a business in Brazil. And I'm not ready to move back to Brazil just yet. Pretty comfortable there. So I think that all of these things contribute to how we think as a fund. Right? There are very few actually founder-led VCs in the region.
Very few.
Yeah. I mean,
huge opportunity in the region.
There's one called Kazakh that people might know of, and that's a great example.
But it's like the biggest and the most successful, but also one of the few.
And I kind of look at this as like a bit of a bookend here because they're leading, they led the Series C in Pomelo, so here we are at the very inception, and then they're writing a Series C. When we started, they were doing seed deals, because there was no real seed funds. It was,
Yeah.
Monashis, Kazakh, Valor, Stella, a few other, early stage VCs. I'm forgetting a bunch, so sorry. So I think that having the DNA of a founder and building this, we're gonna, like, I'm thinking about, maybe I'm gonna go back and relaunch the podcast and do something different in the Bay Area now, and like playing with ideas like that. So it's a lot of experimentation. I remember I think our last meeting with our LPs, I think in December, I started, and it was kind of quoting Mickey Malka, because I get to talk to him every 3 to 6 months whenever he'll make time for a little chat. And it's just like pearls of wisdom just dropped, every time. Hard, harsh feedback sometimes, but from love, like, kind of tough love. And he's like, he told me, like, you can't build something for everyone. You got to build the thing that's you. And you got to say, look, this might not be a good fit for you. And so you kind of are able to identify what your true identity is. And you can, almost selectively choose who you work with. And so I think that's kind of the way we've been building it. There's some media piece, there's some events piece, there's some, community piece, and, we're evolving, right? So whatever we are today, it's going to look a little bit different, probably in a couple of years. Next time I come on the pod, we're going to have something totally different.
It's very interesting that you said about some things you did right, some things you did wrong. And I feel like, especially people operating in Latin America or from Latin America, they're very harsh on themselves for things that they've done wrong. So my next question for you will be, what do you think are the key things that you've done right in Latitude that make you proud, but also that serve a certain inflection point?
The first thing that comes to mind, again, there's probably multiple things, but the first thing that comes to mind is that we've stayed very disciplined in being a pre-seed lead fund. Like, we lead pre-seed. One of the only funds that exclusively leads pre-seed. And that, from a financial standpoint, I think in the long run, it will yield amazing results, because it is much easier to return a small fund than a larger fund. The economics are, it's not like I'm sitting on top of a mountain of management fees and
Not at all.
So, I think I funded a lot of the operations in the beginning of the fund because we had to hire people and we didn't have any money. So we it's very hard to start a fund. It's kind of an unfair,
Especially if it's a small fund.
it's kind of an unfair game. So I think that staying in our lane and obsessing about this moment, where I believe that there's the largest gap where we are. I think that if you look at the evolution of Latin American, investors, now I really kind of think ourselves as a Silicon Valley VC. I'm based in San Francisco, but the explosion of seed funds is like seed and Series A, but really seed. I mean, I don't know how many thousands of seed funds there are in the Bay Area now. It's insane. And even in Latin America, going back to when I started, I could count the funds on one hand, right? Now there's like funds, oh my God, I've never heard of this fund before. That to me is like a surprise and a foreign concept, thinking back to what I was building 10, 15 years ago, right? So having the discipline, staying ultra locked in on that stage. I think the other thing that I would add is that when you look at certain funds and kind of how their thesis, they're, like a lot of the funds in LATAM are very like, oh, we do LATAM moat specific things that, only are enabled because of the mechanics of how the market works in Brazil or in X market. And we have just followed the talent, right? Going back to the numbers, 3% of the founders were building global companies 5 years ago. Now it's, close to 50%. It's at 46% from our last cohort. And, we had to evolve. We could have just said, oh, we're only a LATAM VC. We're actually an expansion of what we were, and it's because we're following the talent. And so being Silicon Valley based, having half of the team based in San Francisco now, that's something that, is a natural progression. And we saw it kind of early, and it became our focus.
I think you told me before that when I asked you, what is your next big natural bet? And you said, oh, Latin American founders built in the US or building from Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
Can you unpack a little bit on that?
Sure.
And
What do you want to talk about?
why do you think that's a long-term substantial tailwinds to build a comprehensive strategy around that and infrastructure around that? Because, winning those deals and supporting those founders, it's a skill set, right? It's an infrastructure.
Yeah, look, I see first of all, we're talking about a region with over 650 million people, some incredible universities. The sheer caliber of talent is, it's high density of very good talent. I'm talking the top decile.
Yeah.
The top decile is
Outliers.
outliers. There's incredible talent. I think that, again, there's kind of two profiles that we are involved with. So I can go back to the why in a little bit in terms of why that is, and I kind of answer that by saying the best founders are actually doing this. So we kind of want to be where the best founders are. I think one of the reasons why they're doing it is because, and again, like we're still very bullish on the region. Like we have a lot of great investments in the region and we'll keep investing in the region. But following the talent, if you look at and maybe I can give an example, like I can take two founders that are building at the exact same stage, starting at the exact same time. The speed to even raise a seed round and the size of the seed round, it's like 3 to 4x sometimes. So if we can identify and find these founders before the local funds in the Bay Area, and we can also translate a little bit of the process of building in the Bay Area, get them connected to the right people. So by leveraging our network that we built over 6 years now in Latin America and be a connector to that, we're basically able to arbitrage talent versus the capital. So if we can underwrite the kind of the Latin American founder, help them speed up the gap that they have in terms of connection. And then there's another bucket, which I think is realistically, like Thais is a good example of this from Taste. She's already fairly connected. We had met her through our fellowship and built a relationship there. And, there was like a mutual respect, I think. And so she decided to let us invest early. She had lots of options. And so we were able to build that kind of relationship, connection, trust before. And, it helps that falamos português também, sabemos como mais a cultura. That's not the reason she would take us, but it helps that there's an affinity and a connection with somebody and there's a bit of trust.
I think it's very important in the market like Brazil.
Yeah. So I think that really underwriting, if we're able to underwrite the best talent from Latin America and a portion of our capital deployed is, going after global opportunities where the capital markets are much deeper, the speed of growth is also, seeing companies, I'm seeing companies go from like, $0 to $10 million in revenue in a short amount of time, right? Like in months, not years. That is something that you very rarely see in Latin America. So that's a factor for us, obviously, like seeing the growth opportunities in the market. So we'll continue to have coverage. It's an America's fund. I'm based in Silicon Valley. I'm spending time building out the network in Silicon Valley. And we want to basically be the landing pad to accelerate your journey. So you're off the plane and then you're in the right rooms.
So when you got into Latin America, like over a decade ago, would you imagine us having this conversation on you building the ecosystem and support around Latin American talents who can totally thrive in these global opportunities in the hub like Silicon Valley?
Yeah. Olga, I wish I could tell you that I had some kind of vision about this in the past. Literally, realistically, I was just a founder that I was chasing a girl. I was living in a country that I liked in Colombia. I was had no money. I was trying to make a little bit of money so that I could pay rent, basically. So that's the true answer, right? Where the ambition that I started with was I need to find an apartment, and why is no one renting to me? Do I smell funny? I'm a mochilero here, So being a backpacker, trying to find an apartment and open a bank account, do basic things. That was my starting point. So at no point, I do remember walking the streets of Bogota, Colombia, trying to sell my English classes and looking up at the skyscrapers and be like, I want to fucking own a skyscraper someday, I want to be in this building, And I remember it was the perfect kind of symbolism for being an outsider. I couldn't even get into the building, right? So I'm sitting here looking up at this, 30-story building on the main avenue in Bogota, and I'm like, how do I get into the building to sell my classes? And I think that I was able to throw on a cheap suit that I had that, I bought for $7, a little short on the cuffs. And I was able to figure out how to navigate through security to get into the building, and, kind of sneak in and then start selling my classes. Once I was in, I closed the deal. I got the deal done. But sometimes there's this, kind of barrier to just getting across to the next side. And then that becomes a realization of like, oh, I can close a deal with a stock brokerage in Bogota, and I can hire a teacher and then make a little bit of money. Wait, let me kind of elevate my thinking a little bit. So that was just a stepping stone that ultimately ended up becoming, I'm going to build like the biggest online real estate business. But it started from like, I just want to get in that building, like I just want to be able to talk to a customer. And so that's kind of, that's been the evolution. So to answer your question, no, I did not see myself in this position of like community building. I saw myself as like, I'm sick of eating these like, shitty lunches that I don't have any money. So I'm eating the menú ejecutivo in Bogota. I need to like figure out how to get some money so that I can, afford the next thing. Right.
I pictured that image of you standing in front of the building. That's me in New York. I'm like looking at all this incredible real estate.
You're a dreamer, right? You're a dreamer.
I'm going to fucking own one of those beautiful penthouses here in Soho at some point. So I get that point.
100%, right? You got to have the mindset.
That is the thing, because you got to like dream it first, and then get yourself to believe that you can.
Yeah, what you believe you can achieve.
What you believe you can achieve, but also more importantly, because nothing we achieve like as a standalone individuals, right?
Yeah.
We need to motivate people. We need, and that's what you do too a lot, right? Like you need to get people to sign up for your religion, to sign up for your belief. And how would you do that if you don't believe that you can buy that fucking skyscraper?
Yeah,
like,
if you don't believe in yourself, who's going to believe in you?
All right, let's do the rapid fire.
Okay, let's go.
I'm going to ask you, I have 6 questions for you.
Okay.
Let's see how that goes.
I'll
First
try to ask
question
the answers.
is, what was the first time you made some real money, and what did it teach you about business?
The first time I ever made money was when I sold some secondary in Viva Real. And I remember it was funny. I remember being at a dinner, and I was sitting around in Sao Paulo in Pinheiros, and like there was all these other founders that were kind of like at a similar stage, or like maybe a little bit, not quite, at like Series B or wherever we were. And everyone was like so curious of how I sold some secondary. Like you made money, like you put some money in your pocket. And I don't remember how much it was, but it was enough to buy a house and a car. And you know what? One of the reasons why I did it, like super candidly, is one, I wanted a little bit of the comfort, but one, I wanted to actually tell my wife that like this shit is real. Like I wanted to translate it into something tangible. And like, because at this point it was like, oh, like we're kind of rich, we're becoming, in a good financial position. But I'm also making like a $5,000 a month salary, and like I've got expenses and I have a kid, on the way. So I think that the moment where I was able to turn that into a little bit of cash, I bought the car, and I bought nothing fancy. I just got a car to A to B, and I bought I could buy an apartment. I bought a house actually in California, and it was something that enabled me to like level set. And then like, okay, I can think a little bit bigger now, because if you don't, and I think secondary, like selling a little secondary, and I'm not talking about like
crazy amount
cashing in and just putting 10 million in the bank. I'm talking like $1 million or whatever it is. I think I'd maybe it was like $2 million or something like that. And it was 500 the first time, and then 2 million later. But whatever it was like something that became significant, where I was able to have like a baseline, and then it enabled you to kind of just like take care of your situation. And then you could kind of like elevate your thinking about the next level of ambition. So I think that is something that was like a thing I learned about myself, where it was like, and another thing I learned also, like I'll just share this. I don't know if it's like wisdom or whatever you want to call it, but there's a point where you make a little bit of money. And one thing that I had this realization, I don't know if I read this somewhere, or like maybe it was like a New York Times article that like broke down like happiness as it relates to money. And if you have like your baseline, like money that like to live at a certain threshold, that like the incremental happiness that goes beyond that. Like I read something about that somewhere, and I really had like that mindset adapted, because I think a lot of founders build this kind of thinking where they're like, oh, I'm going to be so happy once I'm a millionaire, or a billionaire or a trillionaire. Exactly. That kind of like that hedonic treadmill that you get on where you're like, I got to do this in order to unlock this next thing. It's just like, it's just such a false game. Because I remember when I sold my company, all of a sudden I saw some zeros in my bank, and I went and I stayed at the Four Seasons in Baja for, a couple of weeks, and I'm like starting to get fat because I'm just like, eating and like, I don't have any purpose. Actually, the exact opposite happened for a short window where I was like, what am I doing? What's my purpose in all this? And so quickly kind of, iterated on that. And I was like, all right, let me spend some time, talk to founders. Like, that's where I get energy. So I think that is an important realization that I've had about myself, that money doesn't buy happiness. It buys comfort. It buys your ability to like do things, travel, and, see things and have experiences, but take care of the baseline. So I think if founders can like put a little money in their pocket, it's a bad signal if you're selling 20% of your company at the Series B. But if you tuck in a little bit of money in your pocket and you've kind of take care of yourself, you're going to be in a position to kind of think bigger and go to the next step.
I agree 100%. What is your most contrarian belief about venture capital and startups?
The most contrarian belief, I would say, look, this is like so not serving my cause, but like, I think like the best founders, like it doesn't fucking matter. Like no investor, no like outside thing is actually going to matter for the success of the founder. Like I think investors are self-important in like that they're like discover something, or they, like there's certain people that are the biggest outliers and they're like just destined for it. And it's like, you're just fucking lucky you get to be on the ride with them. And that is, it's a very kind of like detached ego you have to have, because people want to think that they're the reason that shit happens, but they're not in most cases. So, and maybe that's not controversial or, or kind of contrarian, but I think that contrary to every single investor you talk to that thinks that they add a lot of value, they don't, most cases. Right.
Who have been the most important mentors or advisors in your life, and what's the most practical advice you've received from them?
I remember being in my shitty little office in Bogota, Colombia, and barely able to pay payroll. I remember having like a difficult customer conversation where like we weren't really delivering like we could. And I remember my dad had a small paving company. It was like a little local company in my hometown.
Sebastopol?
Yeah, it was in Santa Rosa, which we lived in Sebastopol. Santa Rosa is the like big city of like 200,000 people next to the small city of 7,000, the apple farm that, where I grew up. And I remember like having this conversation with him, and it was like the first time someone told me like, you just gotta like, just deliver to your customer. Just like whatever you're, like, okay, maybe the customer is like, and of course there's times where you can fire a customer. It's not that you just do anything just to serve them, but like if you're in the wrong about something, own up to it, take responsibility, be accountable to yourself, and then work your ass off to make the situation right. I think that fundamental advice that I got, and I can remember the phone call that I had, and it was like, I kind of like had to just go bite the bullet and go back and like, just make it right. And I think that is one piece of advice that I've carried with me, where I go out of my way to try to do the right thing and serve people. And I think I've built a pretty continuous reputation of doing that. And so I think that's something that stuck with me. But there's been many other mentors and advisors that have like shaped me. I can list off 5 or 6 of them right now that have had a huge impact on me.
Can entrepreneurial drive be manufactured, or is it innate? Why?
I think it's an innate thing in terms of motivation, and I think that what can happen is there can be levels to ambition that can basically become unlocked over time. Not everyone is like popping out of the womb like Elon and being like, I'm gonna go to the solar system, like that. I don't.
I'm gonna go build data centers in space.
I don't think that's not, that's the top kind of 0.0001%, right?
0.1 Elon.
But I think that like of the top 1% founders or, whatever the top, the top decile of founders, it's not always, and I think that this is even more true in Latin America where, maybe there's a discovery process of what you're capable of that maybe can take a little bit longer sometimes. And I mean, I gave you the example of like my big dream was to get in the building, right? Like how do I get in this building so I can sell my English classes? It's not exactly ambitious or like driven. It's like, it was enough so that I could extend my stay in Colombia and like pay rent for a little while. So I think that you don't have to start off with this like just grandiose vision about what you're doing. I think that the best founders quickly realize what they're capable of, and then they size up their ambition over time. And some are born with it.
Final one. If you could only pass one lesson to the next generation of Latin American founders, what would it be?
I think the one lesson that I would, going back to kind of how we started the interview, it's the self-belief. Ability to just remove the shackles of your mind, that the voice, the internal voice, and to dominate the internal voice doesn't mean that you shouldn't be afraid of failure or like everyone's human. And I think that's fine, but you've got to have the courage to face that, stare it down, acknowledge it, and then just go beat it, go make it happen. So I'd say that's the advice that I would give to founders is believe in yourself, adapt and overcome, and you can build amazing things on caliber with any entrepreneur, whether it's in New York, whether it's in San Francisco. The self-belief is going to get you to the next place, combined with some hard work and some hustle.
Brian, I have been listening to a number of these conversations of yours before because you're very outspoken and you're a very well-known person in the ecosystem and outside the ecosystem. And I just feel so happy right now because I think this was the conversation like nothing you had before.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was a good, you're good.
I'm very.
It's the reason why this is working, right?
It's been a lot of hard. You say you gotta work fucking hard. Like
Yeah.
I've never worked.
I remember
as
when you were
much.
just starting.
Yeah.
When you were just
I've
starting and we had
never worked more in my entire life
Yeah.
than I have been working over the course of the last 5 years.
well, believe in yourself because you're doing it.
Yeah. But imposter syndrome is real. But what I want to say is that it's so interesting to get to know you from a completely different perspective because a lot of Brian persona that I experienced was really heavily leaning on Viva Real, and being that successful entrepreneur and always cheerful Californian, who wrote this incredible book and so on and so forth. But I think the level of your humility and the level of your introspective thinking and kind of trying to understand and connect the dots and trying to really be helpful for the ecosystem and genuinely being all in terms of what you're doing. I think that's something that this conversation helped to uncover. So thank you so much for that. That was
Well, thank
so
you. I think you got to show a side of me that I don't get to share. And I think that's a side of a good interview.